less than 24 hours, Georgians will be under a shelter-in-place order.
McDonald, though, said he did not know the man was handcuffed and was trying to use his foot to pin him to the ground so he could be handcuffed.
If your friends, neighbors, or local organizations are not complying, report them to us.
Hello and welcome to the Free Georgia podcast. My name is Jake Green. Thank you for joining us today. Little housekeeping, please subscribe. If you find this episode entertaining, informative, just anything useful in this podcast, please subscribe, like. We're on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, anywhere you can see a podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all of the above. So please do that. It would greatly help us get the message out there farther and wider. Or is it further and wider? I don't know. Either one. Actually, now that's going to bug me. Is it further or farther? I think it's further because it's not a physical distance. Wow. Okay. Anyway, it is still Educational Freedom and Parental Rights Month. And today we're going to be talking to Elizabeth Melton, who is the Communications Director for LPGeorgia. So let's get to it. All right. And here's Elizabeth Melton, who's the Communications Director for LPGeorgia. Elizabeth, thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me.
I guess technically you're my boss within LPGeorgia, huh?
Well, yeah, I guess technically.
Sweet. Well, I won't grill you too hard then. But it is, since it is Educational Freedom and Parental Rights Month, we've been focusing on that a lot with David DeLugas and Ryan Graham. And I know that you have a lot to share about homeschooling and unschooling. What's your experience with these two things?
Well, with the Libertarian Party, we think that educational freedom and parental rights are very important issues. And it's a classic example of taking charge of your children's education to homeschool them. And it's a very important thing that we should be able to do that. And so we want to support that with the Libertarian Party of Georgia. So we have a homeschooling group that we have online groups on Facebook, and then because we want to help support people that are on that journey, because it can be very intimidating going into it. And so I homeschooled, or essentially unschooled, 2 children to adulthood. And it was one of the most rewarding experiences that I have ever had. And so if I can help anyone else to have that experience, then yeah, I want to be able to do that.
Nice. Yeah, I do remember when I was growing up, we moved to Virginia and started homeschooling for the year that we lived there. And it was by far my favorite year of schooling that I ever had. I don't know, we set our own schedules. It seemed a lot more freeing. I learned more than I had before, and it was just way more fun and effective, I think.
Well, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about education and what exactly that means. And I know one of those things is that education starts on a certain date, the first day of kindergarten, and then ends on a final date, which is your last day of high school, unless you go on to college, and then it ends your last day of college. And I don't think that that's really a good way of looking at education. I think it's more of a natural, organic thing, and it's something that should be taking place throughout your lifetime. So when people first think about taking their children's education into their own hands, it can be very intimidating, because they have this idea that, oh my goodness, I'm going to mess something up. They're going to miss something, and then they're just never going to be able to go back and recover that. And it's just not true. Children are very able to learn, even on their own, when they're ready to learn. And the way that our system is set up for what is the ideal situation? What is the median situation for groups of children? It's not customized for individuals at all. So when people think about, okay, they should know this by this grade level, they should know this by this grade level, that's nothing more than an efficient system that's put in place so that they know what to teach in the classroom. It doesn't mean that if a child learns something a little bit more quickly than that, or if they don't learn it until 2 years later, that somehow they failed.
Yeah, that makes sense. As far as the intimidation factor, I can understand how taking on that kind of responsibility would be super intimidating, as well as like not just on the education side, but on the like knowledge side and the time. And can you just talk about like how long, like how much goes into that on the parent side?
Well, that's because parents have this misconception that they have to recreate a traditional classroom in their home. And you don't have to do that. That's not the only way to learn. And it isn't even necessarily the best way to learn. And they also think that you have to have some sort of set curriculum, that you have to have a certain amount of written work done. And it's almost like if the children aren't miserable enough, then you're not doing a good job. If for some reason they're happy and having fun, that, okay, this isn't proper education. And I know when I went to school, they had all kinds of, like if they had learning games or anything that was fun, that was always done as a reward for having spent the whole day in misery. And it's like you can learn some things just as easily in a fun way as you can sitting there and tediously doing written work or worksheets. You can learn fractions from Legos actually far more efficiently than you can by doing written work. But for some reason, yeah, people look at that and they're like, no, this isn't proper school. They have to be sitting still. They have to be writing. And it's just not true. Not only is it not true, it's not the best way to learn.
Yeah, now that was such a good way to put it. Like, even if you're learning while you're having fun, they, like when I was growing up, they did not care to do that. They wanted you just sitting there being quiet and learning the way they wanted you to learn. And that's just like, that's definitely not conducive to my personality. Like I learned so little in class, and most of my learning was done outside of class. So that's yeah, go for it.
And yeah, personality is a huge thing because children learn differently. And so I always excelled at academic work. I loved reading. I was good at test taking, but that's really not an indication that someone is smarter than another person, because some people are more hands-on. It's just not good to have a one-size-fits-all scenario when it comes to education. And I think that so many people fall through the cracks, and that they fall through the cracks because it's geared toward one type of personality and one type of child. And anyone who is doing something that they're engaged in and that they're passionate about, they're not going to want to get into trouble. They're going to be too focused on doing what they're doing. And so when we have all of these children that they can't capture them, they can't help them find their passion, then they go out, they get into trouble, they lead lives of crime or whatever. But they wouldn't be doing that if school fulfilled the proper function of, let's help each individual child find what they're good at, find what they love, what they're passionate about, and then help them to do that. But every child's not going to want to learn Shakespeare, or everyone's not good at math, and they also want to focus all of the time on, okay, let's help you build up your weaknesses. We're going to completely ignore your strengths. You can read okay, but you're not good at math, so we're just not going to read. We're going to make you do math all the time. That just doesn't even make sense.
No, it doesn't at all. Can you dive a little bit into the differences between homeschooling and unschooling?
So homeschooling essentially would be any method that you use where you teach at home. But unschooling is a little bit different because it gives the children more freedom to direct their own education. So like my children actually started out going to Catholic school. And so, me with my libertarian, anti-authoritarian personality, I guess that kind of rubs off on your children some, maybe. But they didn't do well. And it wasn't that they weren't as smart as everyone else, but that rigid structure of, okay, come in, unpack your book bag, sit down, we're going to do this for 20 minutes, we're going to do this for 30 minutes. Okay, now it's time to do this, that, or the other. They just couldn't conform to that. And so my younger child, especially, he was born, he was like a ray of sunshine. He was this happy, joyful child. And I saw as the years went by, he went all the way up through second grade. And it was like every year, more and more, I saw that light become extinguished. And this bright, happy child become upset, anxious. And it had nothing to do with him. It wasn't that he was disobedient. It wasn't that he was trying to be bad. It wasn't that he didn't want to succeed. But the minute he would sit down and get focused on reading, then it was time to move on to something else. And he just couldn't transition that fast. So when I started homeschooling them, I actually worked. I worked part-time, and that allowed me the hours that I needed to homeschool them. But so then I tried to do the same thing that a lot of parents do, which is, okay, this is what we're going to do. And then we would struggle through to try to get them to do it. And it's like, I taught school for 7 years before I went to work in the corporate world. And I look back on all of the things that I did with my students who weren't ready to learn them. And it wasn't successful. They would memorize it, they would take a test, and then they would forget it because it didn't mean anything to them. So I'm like, no, this is a good opportunity. We have the opportunity now to have a personalized experience for them. And so this is the way that we're going to do it. So every day we would do some writing, some math, and some reading. And after that, it was all self-directed as to what they wanted to learn. And as time went by, they became more and more independent in the kinds of things that they wanted to do. So my younger son, who had struggled so much, he started picking up musical instruments. I had a keyboard, and I let him take that keyboard into his room, and he taught himself how to play. And then he decided that he wanted to try the guitar. So he tried that. He tried the bass. And then he even played around with the drums a little bit. And so he became a musician. And then he started enrolling himself in these sound engineering courses. And this is something, I couldn't have taught him sound engineering. And he certainly couldn't have learned it in school. They didn't have things like that. This is something that he would go out, he would find the workshops, he would sign himself up for it. And all I would do was like bring him lunch and leave him alone. We made sure that he had a Mac, which was what he needed to do all that. He needed with the audio snake. So we made sure that he had the tools that he needed to do it, and then he took it from there. And so by the time he was 17, he was filling in as a bass player for different bands and going on tours.
Wow.
And yeah, he would never, ever have been able to have that experience had he been in a traditional classroom. He may have not even picked up an instrument at all and found out that he had that gift, because every single night was, you get up at the crack of dawn, you go to school, you come home exhausted, you do homework till midnight, so yeah. And then, so once he graduated, he decided that he wanted to do something different. And because he had already been on the road for 6 months, he just was very independent at that point. So he got in his car, he drove out to Montana, he joined the Conservation Corps, and he worked out there for 6 months, put aside some money because he wanted to further his education, and because they offer an educational grant when you do that. And yeah, it just was, by the time he was 21 years old, he had been more places, from Poughkeepsie, New York, down to Miami, Florida, St. Louis, touring. He had had more experiences than a lot of people have in a lifetime.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like it, rather than just being told what to do and how to think, it's more of an exploration on your own, kind of exploring, your own personality, what you like, what you are good at, and actually following what you would want to do rather than, having a super structured education.
Yes. And so it's like everyone needs to be able to know how to read and write, and everyone needs to be able to do some basic math.
Yeah.
And beyond that, so we would have different things. We did belong to a homeschool group, and that homeschool group had a very active teen group, and they also had a twice yearly co-op. And so parents would teach classes, and then the children could choose 2 different classes to take. So twice a year we would go and we would do that co-op, and that exposed them to a lot of different things. And we taught some, like we spent a year reading Shakespeare. We studied government. We went up to DC, took a trip up there. And then part of that study of government was doing like different things that you would never do in school. Like, okay, let's go to a protest and see what this is all about, and just having discussions. A lot of what we learned came down to just talking about things and just having intellectual discussions about things, which are experiences that a lot of kids, they just don't get. You go sit in a class and you generally get talked to rather than participating in a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually just thinking today, like, I wish I had kept my economics textbook from high school, because I don't know what I learned, but it has no relevance to anything that I've ever done in my life. And it's just funny, like on my own, I've gone and read a bunch of Austrian economists and all that kind of stuff, and Creature from Jekyll Island and everything. And I learned more about economy by searching out books that I wanted to learn than I did from any type of schooling.
Yeah, so I remember one of the things that we would do sometimes is we would take walks around the neighborhood, and we would like point out different things and learn the Spanish words for them.
Okay.
And yeah, so and at the time they were like, yeah, you know, this is okay, but they never remembered any of it. And then, so just a couple of years ago, my younger son, he decided, you know, I think I want to learn Spanish. And so he got on Duolingo and he learned Spanish, and then he learned French, and then he tried a little bit of Russian, a little bit of Arabic, a lot of different things. And so now he's to the point where he can speak conversational French, Italian, and Spanish, simply because he just decided that he wanted to do that. And I can tell you that if you try to teach a child a foreign language that has no interest in learning a foreign language, they're not going to learn it. But
Yeah,
because he's finished with high school, it didn't mean that he couldn't go back and do that once he chose to do it, because he's done it.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I definitely learned a lot more foreign language related things. I'm not fluent in anything, but I learned more Spanish when I worked in Dallas with, you know, the Mexican population there, working with all those guys and gals. Learned more Spanish there than I ever did in high school.
And that's where he has kind of perfected this, is just going out and finding people and conversing with them. And you don't do that sitting in a classroom. You have to do it. You have to practice it in real life. So yeah. He went out to LA a couple of months ago and had a layover in Las Vegas, and his plane was delayed, so he was there for a while and just started up a conversation with an elderly woman who a grandmotherly type, and you know, remind me of my grandson. And so they spent like several hours together just talking and speaking Spanish. And that's when and how you learn things is, you know, in real life application. That's how you absorb it. That's how you retain it.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as homeschooling goes, what is it? How doable is it for, let's say, a family who has a couple kids, but both parents work and both parents have to work? Like how would you go about handling a scenario like that?
Well, so there are different ways that you can do that. So for example, when I was in university, I had a literature teacher who they were both professors. She was a professor and her husband was a professor. So she taught the morning hours and he was with their child, and she taught the afternoon hours. Or he taught the afternoon hours and she was with their child. So they were able to work out a schedule like that. So it just depends, I guess, on the ages of your children, whether you have family support. And there are also, I know locally here, we have what's called like a homeschool school, where children can go in and the parents direct their education. Essentially, okay, this is what they're doing, and they get to go in and do their school there in an environment. So they technically do have to go like to a class,
right?
But they get to have that self-directed method of doing it rather than the the general across the board classroom instruction. So that's a good alternative. And there are certain schools, and we need more of them, honestly. We need more schools where children are self-directed. And the Montessori method, we just have to get out of this mindset that there's one way for everyone to be educated, and that way is the way that's dictated by the Federal Department of Education.
No, yes, I completely agree. What are the first, like, let's say Libertarian became governor. Let's say Shane Hazel became governor. What's the first thing, one of the first things he could do to start us down that path as in Georgia?
Well, so we already have moderate laws when it comes to homeschooling. Some states are just ridiculously oppressive when it comes to homeschooling, and essentially that they make it to where you still have to follow very strict guidelines, and you don't have a lot of
Elizabeth, I think we lost you. Cool. Yeah, you had been talking about how oppressive some other states are and how moderate the laws are here in Georgia.
Right. So I think that the biggest issue that we have here in Georgia with parents taking charge of their children's education is just an issue of mindset, that we just have to look at different ways of educating. We have to get out of this idea that there's just one way to do it. Now, they could make it easier. So some states, you just homeschool. You don't have to report to the state at all. You don't really have to do anything. In Georgia, you have to submit a declaration of intent that you are going to homeschool.
Okay.
And then every 3 years, you give them testing, but there are no requirements of what to do with the testing. You just test them and you keep the tests, but you don't have to submit them or anything. And yeah, it's actually a lot easier. So when I first started, you had to fill out like attendance reports every month to send to your local board. So it actually became easier. And so I guess that you could eliminate those things, but those things really aren't that difficult to comply with.
Gotcha. It's more just the mentality of that's too difficult for me to do. Like there's no way I can do it kind of mindset.
Right. So when it comes to like pure homeschooling or unschooling, there's really not a whole lot that needs to be done. But in education in general, I think that what we could do is make it a lot easier to have some different kinds of alternatives, like little small pod schools or community schools. If you're going to make small private schools that can address needs, like for those parents who have to work and who don't feel like they can meet those needs for their children, make it easier for other people to step in and start a business teaching children, and trust parents enough to say, okay, I can go and I can explore all the options and make these choices for my children. And I don't need the government to do all that for me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. Like, I don't know how you start getting people out of that mindset other than just slow, painstaking discussions. Because like it's like that with a ton of things, you know, like everybody thinks the government is supposed to do this and supposed to do that, whereas they didn't always do that, and there's no reason for them to do everything, all these things that we expect or that are expected nowadays. And yeah, that's just seems like a really big task to try try to change people's mindsets on that kind of thing.
Well, there's a meme that I enjoy sharing every time I come across it. That was a quote where someone said, if we at 6 months old, if we started giving children walking lessons, if teachers started giving children walking lessons, that within a generation we would come to think that children couldn't learn how to walk unless they were taught by a teacher to do so.
Right.
And it's so true. It honestly is. And we have had this mentality that we want to delay adulthood to the point where children aren't capable of doing things and adolescents aren't capable of doing things, and they have to be monitored every single second, and they have to be directed and controlled every single second. And essentially what we're doing is we're setting up a scenario where they can't do anything because they have never been allowed to.
Yeah. Reminds me of that show. Did you ever watch the show Arrested Development?
Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of what it reminds me of. You're just basically not allowed. You're just exactly what the name implies. Your development is arrested, and you're not. You don't grow mentally and physically and all these things like as much as you would if you were challenged.
Yeah, children, they have to learn how to take risks.
Mm-hmm.
They have to learn how to manage those risks. They have to learn to be able to do things and take care of themselves. And they can't do that if they're never allowed to have any freedom.
Yeah, and if they're given safe spaces where they can go and avoid all the conflicts that are happening out in the world. Like I know Jordan Peterson said that like giving somebody a safe space is the exact opposite of what you should be doing with them, especially when people are growing up. You should be putting them in challenging situations, into conflict in a safe way, but they should be challenged in everything that they do so that they can grow more. And all of these things that are happening these days with the safe spaces and not allowing certain topics to be discussed and all this kind of stuff definitely seems to be detrimental to people's development.
And you can like give them and teach them the tools that they need to be able to handle those situations, and sit down with them ahead of time and help them work through those scenarios before they do that. You don't have to just, throw them in the deep end of the swimming pool and say swim. You can like help them out a little bit and help them to work gradually toward it. But at some point, then you have to, say you go. And it's hard. It's really hard because I say that children they're both a blessing and a curse. They're a blessing for obvious reasons, but it's a curse because you're never going to have a moment's peace the rest of your life worrying about them. But when you control them and you don't let them do anything and you don't let them go, you're not doing that because it's what's best for them. You're doing that because it's what's easiest for you. And, parents, they just have to come to recognize that letting go is difficult, but it's an important part of growing up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm also not sure that it's so obvious to a lot of people that children are a blessing these days.
Yeah, I guess I can't speak for everyone.
Yeah, I'm not sure those reasons are so obvious to a bunch of people. I feel like a ton of people see the opposite of that and see all of the strife that's gonna occur because of having a kid. Well, Elizabeth, what else would you like to say in regards to homeschooling and unschooling?
Well, I know that a lot of times people will look at it as this is an alternative to public school because public school is terrible and we don't want our children in there. So we're just going to make the sacrifice and homeschool. And they view that as an alternative to something bad. But really, even if we had the best schools, homeschooling is just a superior form of education. It's better for children, even if they have wonderful teachers and wonderful facilities. The idea that they go and that they sit in a desk for hours and that their days are structured and they're constantly monitored and they have no freedom, that is not a good scenario. And it doesn't matter how much money you throw at it. It doesn't matter how well behaved the children are. That's just doing them, it's just doing them an injustice. And I would say that anyone that has reservations about it, I highly recommend reading John Taylor Gatto. He's written several books, and he was an award-winning teacher until he finally is like, you know, what I'm doing here is not serving children. I'm harming children, and I'm not going to do it anymore. And Grace Llewellyn is also, she's written a book called The Teenage Liberation Handbook, which is a great book.
Okay.
And we were talking about like helping children to manage risks and so forth. And so one of the things that I've noticed, like in Europe, where they have a culture there. So I knew a fellow who was from France, and when he grew up, when he was 5 or 6 years old, they would put a little bit of wine in the bottom of a glass, and they would fill the rest of it up with water. And then the older he got, the more they would transition to more wine and less water, until he got to the point where he was an older teenager and he could drink wine and he could tolerate it. And we don't do that here. Instead, we're like, no, you're forbidden. You're forbidden until you're 21 years old. So then what happens? That's where the frat culture comes from. It's like, okay, I'm free now. And so this is why you have all of these college students who just absolutely go hog wild because they've never been able to do anything or allowed to do anything their whole life. Mm-hmm. And these aren't parental choices. Parents aren't even allowed to make those choices for their children. Right. And they should be able to. This is not a government issue. The government shouldn't be dictating these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Yeah, you're right. I mean, if you're restrained for 18 years and then all of a sudden you're let free on your own, you're probably going to make some pretty bad decisions here and there.
And you set up a situation where it's an adversarial relationship between adults and children. Mm-hmm. Children, they go to school, they don't look at the adults around them as wise mentors, as people that they look up to and want to grow up and emulate. They look at them as the enemy that's trying to control them. Mm-hmm. And that's not a healthy way for a society to operate, in my opinion. No,
not at all. Elizabeth, our time's almost up. What is the LP doing? Is LP doing anything this month in regards to educational freedom and parental rights?
Well, you were doing a lot of great podcasts, and we have a couple of interesting blog articles out there that could be read on the website. We're doing a giveaway. We're giving away 2 sets of Tuttle Twins books. And so if you went out on our Facebook group, you should be able, and I think it's actually pinned on the Twitter account to the top. So yeah, go out and register. The last day is the 31st. So there's only a few days left to register for that. And also I encourage people to sign up for our Liberty Watch, which is our call to action network, because when the legislative session meets in January, we have people in the Libertarian Party of Georgia that paying very close attention to policy. And so whenever anything comes along with education, if there's anything that's concerning to libertarians, then we will send out that call to action so that you can contact your representative and let them know how you feel.
Nice. I love that. That's amazing. So yeah, for the Tuttle Twins book, you got to go to our Twitter, which is LPGeorgia, or our Facebook group or page, or both.
I think it should be in both.
Okay, perfect.
But I definitely know that it's in the group. If you search on the group, you should be able to find it.
Nice. And those links will be in the episode description.
Yeah, and also I think it's lpgeorgia.edu freedom should take you to that link.
Oh wow. Okay. I didn't know about that link until just now. Well, cool. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining the podcast. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we sign off?
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thank you all for tuning in. If you got something from this podcast, please drop a like, subscribe, share it. Share it is actually probably the best thing you can do besides subscribing on YouTube, Apple, Spotify. Follow us on Twitter. We're just launching an Instagram, Facebook, all of the above. And yeah, we'll see you again next week. Thanks for watching.